All right, let's go ahead and test out some AMD hardware in this game as well. We'll be looking at the RX 6800 XT. Right now we are running the opening sequence and we are in the 4K settings, but we do not have ray tracing enabled yet. So this is 4K, very high settings. And if we're getting good performance here, we'll try kicking on some ray tracing, but of course we will also be trying out some upscaling with this game's FSR 2.0 implementation. I'm so excited to see them implementing the latest tech like this. Let's see, I need to remember sort of what the buttons do. Don't judge my web slinging, guys. I'm just testing out the game and I'm staring at my frame rate counter. And right now it is looking like we are during web swinging with maxed out other than ray tracing 4K settings, hanging out above the 60 FPS experience. Now I'm going to intentionally land here to kind of get a spot where we can look at performance. So we're kind of in the mid 70s here in the city with the big crowd. It goes up into the 80s. So overall performance here to me looks really good with maxed out non-ray traced settings. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at those settings so you guys can see them and then play around. So as we can see here, there's currently no upscaling enabled, and we are on the very high preset with ray tracing settings turned off. Now, let's go ahead and try out some ray traced reflections. We'll turn them on, and it'll take a minute to process, of course, so give the GPU some time. It's gonna be struggling here for just a second. And okay, it looks like we have kicked on some reflections. You can start to see them kind of fade in on the windows and things behind us. I do love that this game gives us a menu system where we can see the changes take place as they occur. All right, looks like we're dropping down into the 30s. But again, there is no upscaling kicked in yet, and this is 4K resolution. So let's also see what would happen if we went ahead and changed some things, right? So we have the very high settings, and we also have the high settings, and that's for the reflections as well as for the geometry detail. So if I just go down to high on the reflection resolution, I'll flip between them. Like you can see on the vehicles and stuff that things certainly change on high versus very high. It doesn't look exactly the same. Perhaps if we were closer to a window or something. But it does seem like going down to high, well, got us very close to 60 FPS at a native resolution here, although running around, we're dipping more into the 40s. But again, remember, this is also the 4K resolution rather than 1440p, where a lot of people will be, and we will test that out in a second. Trying to find a window where there might be reflections or something. Let's see if there's any reflections on this window for us to take a look at as we kind of flip through these high and very high settings. So again, yeah, if I go to very high, I'm certainly seeing there's a little bit more reflected in the window. I'm sure you could find a window that showed it off a little bit more. We've also got the geometry detail with very high, but we can also go down to the high settings, which it's struggling to load in here for a second. Okay, so if we go down to the high ray trace settings, and currently leaving the object range at 6, and that's going to put a heavy emphasis on the CPU, and we wouldn't want to run into CPU bottlenecks, for at least for now, leaving it at the default of 6. So this is high ray tracing at 4K native resolution. And we're actually pretty dang close to a 60 FPS experience. I mean, we're dropping a bit below 60, but on my variable refresh rate screen, it actually feels pretty dang good. So why don't we play on this for a little while, swing around and all that, and look at, okay, 4K high ray tracing. Yeah, it's not going to be a locked 60 FPS experience, but it is certainly very, very playable on variable refresh rate. I would be absolutely fine playing with these settings. But let's go ahead and see what's going on with FSR 2.0 in this game. So it's nice to see this game gets it. Not too many games with that out yet. My overall impression in some other games has been it doesn't look quite as good as DLSS, but it can be pretty close, especially at 4K resolution like we're at now. So we're going to switch this upscale method over to AMD FSR 2.0, so it's going to render the game at a lower resolution. I'm going to start out with the quality setting, which will be the best looking version. Now I've got to click apply. All right, FSR 2.0 quality. Standing still, I think things look fairly good. I think I might see a little bit more flickering to some of the tiny details in the distance. In motion is where this tends to struggle the most. I'm looking at Spider-Man's legs and things as he's running to make sure they look reasonably good. And honestly, if I'm not completely just pixel peeping looking for problems, I would say that this is pretty dang acceptable image quality and did get us a very nice boost to our performance. So now we are comfortably well above 60 FPS as we swing through the city. And that's very good to see. So yeah, FSR 2.0 at the quality setting, especially at 4K where we have a lot of extra resolution to work with and we've got a lot of performance we want to kind of claw back, especially with ray tracing enabled. It's nice to see that we can run a game with 4K ray tracing here with a little bit of upscaling. Like I said, I think there's a little more creepy and crawling to the edges of some of the images and things like that if I'm really, really carefully looking for it. But I think this is certainly acceptable image quality that you could use if you're interested in the ray traced reflections. But does this mean that we could kick on to a higher ray tracing setting? So we got some reflections in this window, and that might be a good opportunity, except I think I want them on this side of me to see while we're in the menus. This would be a good opportunity to look again at what if we turn the ray tracing up higher, if the GPU can keep up, maybe with some more aggressive upscaling. So we have the geometry detail and the resolution. Let's try kicking up the geometry detail and see what happens. It'll take a second to process, so we're switching from high to very high on the geometry detail. And I certainly do think the objects in the mirror look a little bit higher quality there. And then reflection resolution, we'll switch that up to very high as well. Am I crazy, or does that almost look more pixelated when I went to very high? Let me switch it back to high for a second. Maybe it's just this particular reflection, but I almost preferred the image I was getting on the high setting. It seems more pixelated around the edges of the objects. I don't know. But let's go ahead and leave it at the very high settings for a second. And try out with with FSR quality mode if we can get any kind of, decent performance here. Actually, I mean, we are dipping below 60 FPS at times. But this is very, very playable. Why don't we go ahead and check if in this scene here, we've found one where I'm kind of below 60 FPS here, at least a little bit. Where was it? Right here? Okay. Let's see if kicking the FSR 2.0 onto the balanced setting would get us back up over 60 FPS here. So balanced setting. All right. Again, standing still, the image looks pretty good at this setting, but let's get in motion and see if I start to notice any more break up to the fine details or anything. Again, at 4K resolution, we do have a lot of resolution to work with. I do feel like, especially as Spider-Man's turning around and stuff, I'm looking at him as he does his flips and things in motion, And as objects are kind of disoccluded, meaning you could see them, you couldn't see them in the previous frame because they're being uncovered from him. I do see a little bit of breakup to the image now, more so than I did at the quality setting. So I can notice a bit of lost image quality here with the balanced setting, but it's not terrible. It's very usable, and some people will be more or less, affected by, have your experience more or less affected by noticing the, I guess the little bit of breakup to the image that we're seeing there. Now, I think that it might be worth checking out the 1440p performance. So let's go ahead and say that yes, you can use ray tracing at 4K here. If you want to use the heavier ray tracing, it's looking like you might need to go down to a FSR 2.0 balanced or somewhere around there. But let's go ahead and actually turn upscaling off again. But this time we're going to drop down to actually just more people have a 1440p monitor than have a 4K monitor. So let's test that out. So this is 1440p, and notice that we still have the ray tracing settings on very high. Again, I'm still leaving the object range at the default of 6. So 1440p, very high ray tracing. You know, we're not quite at 60 FPS, but I'd say we are pretty close. Dipping a little bit here and there. Try web swinging a bit. Again, don't judge my web swinging. I have no idea how to play this game, guys. I've just been benchmarking it. How do I get back going on the city? Help. Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man needs to just run up a wall to get started, I think. Okay. There we go. Alright, swinging around the city and such, it seems like... Oh, I'm leaving the mission area. Okay. Sorry. Seems like swinging around the performance is pretty good here with these maxed out ray tracing settings. Let's try out, if we did want to use FSR, we could try FSR at the quality setting at 1440p, which can look pretty good. Apply. Again, I think standing still, you know, I might see a little bit more instability, especially to the people kind of walking by, and some of the lines in the building across from me and such. Let's check in motion. Performance seems good here. Now, there's some dips where my GPU usage seems to be dropping into the 80-something% range, in which case it's most likely, I would guess, a CPU limit of some kind. The ray tracing in this game can be very CPU heavy, so despite the fact that I have a 5950X, that's one reason why I'm leaving the distance setting or whatever it was at the 6 rather than trying to turn that all the way up, because I want to see the GPU performance rather than the CPU limits. All right, here's a nice ray traced reflection here, and this might give us a chance to, let's turn down the ray tracing settings one more time, but this time at the 1440p. So if we lower the geometry detail, again, this will take a little second to process. I've clicked the button, but we're going to lower the geometry detail. Wow, okay, there, it's starting to load back in. I was going to say, initially that looked pretty bad. Honestly, the reflection seems okay, you know. Kick the resolution down to high. Okay, so once again, very high. High. Okay. I mean, at least in this scene, the difference is, you know, you can see there's a difference, but it seems fairly subtle. All right, so we're on the high settings, and I'm going to turn off FSR. So we're now running at the native image quality, 1440p, with the high ray tracing settings rather than the very high ray tracing settings. And actually, guys, the performance here really seems quite good. I know we're not getting quite that reflection detail, but man, when you're running through the city, do you really notice a lot of the detail in the reflections? I don't know, when you're just swinging around. So yeah, the performance here, again, we're seeing some dips into the 60s where it looks like the GPU usage drops a bit, so I'm wondering if it's, again, a bit more of a CPU limit. So the last thing I'd like to look at here is just the native performance at 1440p. And then we'll actually just play through the game a little bit, I think. Not native, but I mean non-ray traced performance here as a comparison. So we saw that you absolutely can get some playable above 60 FPS performance with ray tracing while in the city and web slinging. But it does come at a very significant cost. We can see here that when we're not ray tracing, you can get a very high refresh rate experience. And that might be worth it, because I'm going to be honest, guys, while the reflections are certainly more accurate with the ray tracing, because like these reflections are kind of fake. When you look behind you, that's not necessarily what's actually behind you there, you know. But there's certainly reflections in the windows, and I can't see behind myself when I'm just web slinging, so I'm just going to say that the reflections in the game without ray tracing look okay. I think the main difference is seeing Spider-Man himself reflected in them. I don't know. So I certainly don't blame you if you want to just turn off the ray tracing and have a really high refresh rate experience. And it's looking like this GPU is certainly able to deliver a very high refresh rate, non-ray traced experience. So why don't we hop into a little bit of combat, play through some of this opening sequence at some various settings, and kind of see what happens here. Skin performance seems great here, and this isn't ray traced. Can I skip the cinematic real quick and just kind of get into some things? All right, let's get into a little bit of combat. Oh, it's teaching me. My spider senses are tingling. Gotta dodge. Again, this is the non-ray traced performance. Maybe in this combat, let's take a look at in combat, could we maintain performance with the ray traced reflections at the high setting? So let's let that kick on here. It takes a second to process. Come on. There we go. So ray traced reflections on. Again, we are still at the native 1440p resolution. Getting some more enemies in here. Dodging some bullets, webbing some people up.
Almost done here. You? We're about to go in. Be there soon. Can't wait to see Willie's face when you slap the cuffs on.
All right, let's just you know, beat up some guys and see what happens.
Okay, Yuri, all done. What's happening?
Performance seems pretty good.
Yuri? Yuri! I knew Fisk wouldn't go quietly.
So, you know, these high settings are probably somewhat similar. Not exactly, probably, but, you know, this game was designed with console ray tracing in mind originally. So since they run AMD hardware that I think is not as powerful as a 6800 XT. It's not surprising that we're able to get decent performance out of it here. But yeah, it really looks like the ray tracing is surprisingly usable here at 1440p.
I'm gonna go, do your thing.
Should we try out the very high in combat? Let's do it. Just going up to very high reflections. You can kind of see them changing in the background there just a little bit. We'll kick up the geometry detail as well. That one will take a little second to load in, so give it a minute to process there. All right, we've got the very high geometry detail and reflections. Feeling we'll be a little below 60 FPS now. It's looking like mid-50s or so in that cutscene, but now we're actually looking pretty good again.
Hey, where you going?
Dipping in that cutscene when the window breaks isn't that big of a deal. See how the gameplay actually feels. Okay, where are the bad guys at? What's it teaching me? Okay, I can heal. I get bonuses with air combat. Look at me go. Now, if I play through the intro so many times testing out GPUs, eventually I might remember what the buttons do. You know, sometimes people criticize my gameplay when I'm benchmarking stuff. I'm like, do you guys realize that most of the time I'm staring at the FPS counter? Okay. Or looking at the reflections and things. I'm not really playing the game. This is not a gameplay video. Not that I'm claiming I actually know how to play the game all that well. It does seem quite fun, though, from the bit I've played. So I think I will play this game after I'm done benchmarking it. Alright, we can heal. Yeah, the performance here seems really solid. Even with the maxed out ray tracing, it's a good experience. I might kick on the FSR 2.0 a little bit. That quality setting. Yeah, and I mean, with the very high reflections and all that, and geometry detail, 1440p with the FSR 2.0 quality, which does look pretty good. It's not absolutely perfect, identical to native, and I do think DLSS looks slightly better, but certainly not a bad upscale, and the performance is really, really solid.
Come on.
Which is very nice to see.
They shut the elevators down. Take the stairs. I prefer a more direct approach.
All right, what's our more direct approach, Spider-Man?
Spider-Man, status.
Heading to the upper floors, hoping nobody turns on the elevators.
Our choppers are taking fire. Looks like Fisk has armed men on every floor.
He's desperate.
And he's hitting us with everything he's got.
I have to find him and end this.
Not yet. We just picked up chatter. They're wiping all their data servers.
Right, let's crawl through these crawl spaces.
Okay, server room it is.
See, I feel like I see a little instability to things like that fan
Call from May. Better answer.
with the upscale.
Hi, Aunt May.
What is all that noise?
I'm watching a superhero movie. What's up?
I just wanted to make sure we're still on for game tomorrow.
This room seems pretty demanding with the big window and lots of reflective surfaces and such, but
You too?
again, with the FSR quality, we seem to be doing pretty well. I do think it's Spider-Man himself in motion. And as things are disoccluded, that looks the most I don't know, obvious that we're not at the native resolution. But again, I do think it's good enough that you could certainly use it. All right, I would like to try out a little bit more 4K now that we're in some combat rather than in the open city. So let's go ahead and go 4K resolution. We'll go back to the native performance and turn off ray tracing for a second. So we are now, native 4K, no ray tracing. I don't think that properly applied the resolution, guys. Yeah, that didn't actually save the resolution. I was going to say that I could tell image quality-wise we were still upscaled 1440p. Okay, there we go. Apply the settings. Now we are properly at 4K native with no ray tracing.
On to the next one.
In combat. I really think the game looks very good even without the ray tracing setting. So
Gotta find that server room before there's no evidence left.
all right, so I mean we have we can see there's some very clear reflections in the floor here. Why don't we kick on the ray tracing again at 4K and try some of it in some interior combat. So ray traced reflections going from off to very high. Let's see if that floor becomes mind-blowing enough to be worth the performance hit. Takes a minute to process. I mean, that's certainly a very, very different and I think more realistic reflection on the floor. Now, how much that adds to your overall gameplay experience, I don't know. It's looking like at native maxed out 4K, we're more of a 30 FPS kind of experience here.
If I go in this way, they'll destroy all the evidence.
And dipping below 30 as well. So I am going to definitely, if we're going to try the maxed out ray tracing, kick on the 2.0 FSR again. We'll try quality first, see where that gets us. Pretty close to 60 FPS, but again, I think we were finding that if we want to max out the ray tracing, the balanced setting out in the city seemed to be the choice, and it's looking like interior scenes, that is going to be the choice as well.
There we go.
You see lots of reflections and such in the windows here and everything. All right, let's go ahead and play on these settings a bit. So see if I think that this might be one of the recommended ways to go for 4K on this GPU. See how we do in a little more extended gameplay through this kind of combat mission. You know, most games on this GPU haven't really had a 4K ray tracing experience that's been worth talking about. So it's nice to see this game doing a better job. Am I lost, guys? I think I'm lost. Did I go back the way I came? I did, didn't I? You know, you only get the finest gameplay experiences here, testing out all of the vents. You know? Again, on the upscale, like the character models in motion during combat. But this looks pretty good. Like, I think this is a very reasonable way to play this game if you want to get the ray tracing effects enabled.
Gotta access that console before everything's gone.
Very reasonable.
Just how good their security is. Oh, you guys forgot the latest kernel patch.
And in a scene like this, where there's not a whole lot of movement and disocclusion and such,
frantically erasing his search
The
history.
upscale's really good. Spider-Man himself looks really sharp in this cutscene.
True, but that's part of my charm, isn't it?
Just really happy that AMD did get FSR 2.0 out there. I'm, hopeful to see some updates to continue to improve it.
Get past him. Destroy everything. Look around.
Because it certainly isn't perfect.
What have you ever done, man?
Looks like we dropped a little below 60 FPS during a bit of this combat, but if I hadn't been staring at my frame rate counter, I wouldn't have noticed. Again, on a variable refresh rate screen, it smooths that out quite a bit.
It's a long, tough road, Fisk. Almost sad to see it end.
Me afraid.
We'll get ready for the main event.
All right, the last thing... Oh, there's still some guys here. I wanted to test out was 4K again in combat, but we'll go back down to the high settings. Takes the geometry detail a second to load here, so give it some processing time, guys. It's thinking. Okay, so we've kicked those down to high, and then we'll start out with native once again. So we will 4K native, ray tracing high rather than very high. Playable frame rates here, that's for sure. Although certainly below 60 FPS.
Yuri, an explosion just...
I saw it. This could have the whole place wired. I'm sending in a bomb unit.
I'll make sure no one gets in their way.
Wow, it's really cool to me that you can get some decent ray traced reflections and play at the native 4K resolution. But I think that at least going down to the quality setting on the upscale might be worth it to get a much higher frame rate. And again, at 4K, the FSR quality does look quite good.
Clear, move up. Hey guys, I guess bombs are part of Willie's getaway plan? Sounds like they're trapped.
So I think, I'm going to test it out a little bit more. But I'm tempted to say that this might be my settings that if I was going to be playing this game at 4K on this GPU that I would probably use. You get enough of the ray traced reflections that you're getting a lot of those benefits to the image. And the FSR 2.0 at the quality setting at 4K is looking very good. I'm not seeing anything completely distracting me from the game or anything like that. Nothing particularly bad. And by making those small compromises, FSR 2.0, along with the just keeping the ray tracing at high instead of very high, this is a very good 4K experience with very good frame rates. So yeah,
Coming your way.
I'm actually very impressed
Could be better. Our choppers took a beating.
with the AMD performance here.
Chopper, we have no one to stop it from landing.
And no one to chase him if he flies away.
Why do I get the feeling
Now I do want to test it out a bit more, so let's get through this vent.
Damn. Yuri, get EMTs up here, fast.
we're trying?
Make sure we don't see any big issues or anything.
Incoming!
Yeah,
That's enough out of you.
really should learn how to actually play the game, but you know.
More rockets? Blue accelerate.
I'll just get blasted in the face with some rockets instead. Alright guys, it's looking to me like there's definitely some very playable settings combinations. You can get ray tracing going on the AMD GPUs at both 1440p and 4K, which is really nice to see. like I said, I think my 4K settings right now are the ones I would go with if I was playing it using the ray tracing high, and FSR quality with the very high settings. For everything else, things are looking good and running well. Feels very smooth. I have no issues with these frame rates, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.